Hello, everybody. Hello to our studio audience, and hello to, I don't see the people on Zoom right now, but I'm sure there's a lot of you there. I want to welcome you to First Center Religious Science here in New York City. Welcome to everybody that's on Zoom and those of you who will be watching on Facebook and YouTube this week. I want to thank you for being with us and supporting our message. I read a message from Sizu. Sizu, by the way, handles our social media, or at least most of it. And he told me in an email that 141 new people signed up and listened to our lessons this week. So that's pretty amazing. We have several thousand people now that watch us and listen on a somewhat regular basis. And a few of them made contributions to the center, so that's great also. I want to welcome the new people in particular, and I want to say that you're in the right place, even if you, there's no accidents, in other words. When you show up at a New Thought Center, we have the saying, perfect time, perfect place. All I can say is stay with us, because a lot of the things we talk about may sound altogether different than what you may have heard, you may have grown up hearing. If you stay with us and you stay plugged in, and if you keep letting yourself have it wash over you, great things are in store for you. I looked up last night religious science principles. It was called the Declaration of Principles. It was written by Ernest Holmes, who was the founder of our textbook, and I'm going to share them with you today. We do it periodically. For those of you who are what I'll call old timers, it's a good reminder for us also. So it's entitled, from 1927, when it was originally posted, What We Believe. And it starts out by saying, we believe in God, the living Spirit, Almighty, right? One indestructible thing, one absolute and self-existent cause. This thing that we talk about in the first step of our affirmative prayer, this one manifests itself in and through all creation. That means it's in all of us, but it's never absorbed by its creation. The manifest universe, meaning everything you can imagine, is the body of God. It is the logical and necessary outcome of the infinite self-knowingness of this source. We believe in the individualization of the Spirit within each and every one of us, and that all people are individualizations of the one Spirit. We believe in the eternality, the immortality, and the continuity of the individual soul, forever and ever expanding. We believe that heaven is within us to the degree, and we experience it to the degree that we become conscious of it. We believe the ultimate goal of life is to have a complete freedom from all discord and every nature, and that this goal is sure to be attained by all of us. We believe in the unity of all life, and that the highest God and the innermost God is the one God. We believe that this Spirit, this source, is personal to all who feel this indwelling presence. We believe in the direct revelation of truth through our intuitive and spiritual nature, and that anyone may become a revealer of truth who lives in close contact with this indwelling Spirit. We believe that the universal Spirit, which is God, is source, operates through a universal mind, which we call the law of God. And that we are surrounded by this creative mind, which is always receiving the impress of our thoughts and acting upon them. We believe in the healing of the sick and the control of conditions through the power of our mind, our consciousness. We believe in the eternal goodness, the eternal loving kindness, and the eternal givingness of life to all. We believe in our own soul, our own spirit, and our own destiny, for we understand that the life of all is God. So that brings us to today's lesson. I was going through a lot of material with Jimmy this week, and we selected a manuscript we had of Raymond Charles Barker. I know I've been doing some of his gems a bit lately. I'm about ready to move on to something else simply because I need to keep mixing it up for myself and for you. This lesson is particularly important. It's a good science of mind lesson. So I want to share some of it. I'll be using his words and my own. He started out by saying, we believe definitely that the mind of the individual is the universal mind. What you have within is not separate from the mind that created the cosmic order. It's part of that mind. It's a function of that mind. Now, when we're thinking of mind, we are dealing with the creative aspect of life. So when he uses mind, you have to remember he's thinking of what you might call God, or this eternal universal presence. Everything comes out of it. This building that we're in, or the home that you're living in, or the apartment, came out of it. Look around yourself, wherever you are, and whatever you're observing, it came out of this mind. The very fact that we're on a Zoom call, or some of you will be watching Facebook rebroadcasting, YouTube, whatever you're using, the technology that brings our message to you, the room that you're in, everything comes out of this creative mind. This mind created it all. Mind and creative intelligence is an action right now through us as a unit and through us individually. Barker talked about a teacher that he had many years ago who repeated a phrase over and over. He said that's all she ever said. She said, there are not minds many, there is only one mind. I'll say it again for emphasis. He said, there are not minds many, there is only one mind. Try to remember this because it'll help understand the teaching. See, a lot of people have a tendency to talk about other people and other energies and this and that and all that. And if you're really working this teaching, you've got it down, you're taking it into a greater degree, you're going to increasingly start to realize there's nothing outside of you. There's no good energy and bad energy. There is energy. Now, I might be experiencing it in different kind of ways, but it's still one energy, one spirit, one God. This creative substance, this force, this one energy, that's all that there is. You'll hear us say in many lessons, if you're with us over a period of time, that God is all that there is. We live, we move, we have our being in this divine substance. There's not two substances. Because you go into the whole subject of two substances, you're going to be in other religions where there's good and evil and all of that stuff. Some of you have grown up with it. I know I did. So there's one energy, one life, one power, one presence. So you got to get that idea down and have it. Barker said it's got to be part of your consciousness. And once you really have that, and you're rooted in this idea of oneness, which we talk about forever, in my ministerial class track, the third year, we really talked about that word only, oneness. A year and a half, actually, speaking about that one word. So that's something you dwell on. I don't think you get it right away. Most people don't, but increasingly you come back to it. So we want to get that down, he said, deep within. So it's a part of our consciousness. He said, it took me quite a while. In truth, again, like I often say, there's nothing outside of you. And that can take a lot of time to internalize also. And he said, everyone begins to see this as you start to practice this teaching, because if you're practicing the presence, you're practicing the presence here, there, and everywhere. If I'm doing that, it's God looking at God all the time. Your mind, one of the things we're teaching here is your mind is not limited to what you, the intellect, would know. Your mind is not limited by your experience either. Your mind has access to the universal creative mind that created everything. See, you can go within and access anything. If you put a demand on consciousness, and you sit, you do your meditative practices, you put a demand on consciousness, there's nothing that's deprived you. All information that you need will come to you. And this same information that comes to you is creating all things and will forever be creating all things. That's your mind. That's what you have. That's the mind you're using right here and right now. We call it the mind of God. We call it the mind of truth. We call it by many names. But it's your mind and it's my mind right now. Now here's a powerful affirmative statement that I picked up from Dr. Barker. He said, let's be still right now in this moment and recognize that everything is spirit. All source energy, everything is spirit. And take this thought into our subconscious minds. Take this awareness that all the wisdom and all the intelligence, all the know-how and all the creativity of life is now in action in your mind and my mind. The total action of the creative spirit is now in action in your mind and my mind. Far beyond that which we can consciously realize, with depth, with possibility, with grace, it's all here in you, operating through you. It's in all of us right here, right now. And I'm going to affirm that we subconsciously accept this today. And so it is, and so it is. First Church of New York, now called First Center of Religious Science, for many, many years sang a song at the beginning of its services. We don't sing it anymore, thankfully, because I've heard some of the people singing it in the old tapes. But I'd like to speak the lines as part of today's lesson. You've heard it before, many of you. We build a new tomorrow. We draw the pattern clear. We make our plans with wisdom, for mind does ever hear. Our thinking makes our future, our actions pave the way. We build a new tomorrow on the patterns formed today. We clear our hearts of hatred. We clear the mind of fear. We speak no word of censure of all we see and hear. With the love of God within us, right, to guide us, with mind to light the way, we build a new tomorrow on the site we clear today. So, good morning again. My topic for the morning came from some manuscripts we have of Raymond Charles Barker, our founder. We have his notes, and so it's my pleasure to bring it to you. And he's speaking in this lesson on the absolute futility of worry. Now, we all know this. Negative thinking and worry is harmful. We know this, and we proceed to go on doing it anyway. It takes a while to calm all this down. It takes practice of the teaching, but it's worth the effort. I've known many people over the years who are really pretty good at this. And then I know people who are not good at this. But Barker was saying people have worried throughout history. There have been places and times where worry was tied into survival. He was talking about primitive people. They naturally worried about their food sources and survival. People worried about protecting their families. They worried about their, all kinds of things. And he said, in this era, we don't have to have all those particular fears. We have solved many of those basic survival issues. But he said, here we are in this day and age, and we're still worrying, though. And he says, some of us are very, very good at worrying. Not that it'll get you very far. Every once in a while, he admitted himself, when he sits at home, he says, I find myself worrying too. And he says, as soon as I do, I stop myself immediately. And he says, what on earth am I doing this for? And this is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. He mentioned the scriptures that day in that lesson. He said, it's interesting, from the beginning to the end of them, there's a theme running through every book. And he wasn't just talking about the Bible, but he was thinking of a lot of the scriptures in the world. And he says, the theme is, fear not. He says, be not afraid. He says, it seems like every prophet taught this. Every once in a while, these writers were saying, in essence, he says, every one of them were saying, in essence, stop being afraid. So here's an exercise for you today. When you have a quiet moment, when you're all alone at home, just calmly close your eyes and ask. See, I don't do this. What am I afraid of? Because I wouldn't want to bring it to mind. But he suggested it as an exercise. Ask yourself, what am I afraid of? What is it that I am afraid of? And he said, look at it. Face it. See it in your mind's eye. Face it and say, all right, if this is what I'm afraid of, what can I do about it? Inquire within. Ask yourself, what can I do about it? So, see, it's one thing to have fear, and I'm sure all of us, including myself, have some. He said, you'll find things that you are afraid of. He says, so face it. He says, because otherwise you just got all this stuff, it's just there. He said, I'd rather face it right, because he says it's a bunch of nothing, Ask spirit within, what can I do about this situation? What's the most self-loving thing I can do? Which is the one I usually use. And you will always receive guidance. If you don't look at it, you don't want to look at it, you suppress it. That's not really going to help you. So he's suggesting look it square in the eye. Barker said that day that he had conquered most of his fears, including death. Now he started joking about death. He's saying because of my own beliefs, my own conviction, I'm not afraid of death. He said, but I am afraid of dying. And then with humor, he said, once I get there, I'm all right. He laughed. He said, I want to get there fast, though. And he went on to say, by the way, fear of dying is normal. He says it's perfectly normal. So if you have it, you're not peculiar, you're not strange. He says, accept it. We're all eventually going to make a transition. In terms of dealing with our transition, he commented, here's my suggestion. Build faith, build conviction. Build a mental pattern so that the idea will affect you less and less. He said, is that your basic fear? Is that it? He said, we all have that one, so build your faith and conviction, that you're supplied and supported, and that all is well. And then he asked the question, and what are you going to do about your other fears? And some people have a lot of fears. What are you going to do about them? He says, now most of the world will just float along just the way they are, and they won't deal with them. They'll look the other way. He said, that's the way most of the crowd does it. They have all kinds of fears. They float along just as they are. They live with them. And they live out their lives with their fears, and somehow they get by. And then he said, see, this reminds me of other teachers. He says, I don't think you and I just want to get by, though. Not this teaching. So, you can keep all these fears running. He said, but you don't have to. He says, I don't think you and I just want to get by. He said, I'm not terribly interested in getting by, really. Are you? People here are longing for a better life, and they're longing for more. And he says, I want the best there is in life for me. And I want you to have the best life for you. And I'm not talking about money, although that helps. He says it actually helps quite a bit. But I'm talking about the fullness of the experience of life, of a life well lived. He says, I want that. He said, and I'm sure most of you do too. And he asked the question, what can I do personally to have a richer, fuller life experience? What can I do or say to myself to minimize or help eliminate all these fears? And he said, because it's obvious there's a lot of constant worrying going on. See, he, like me, we get a lot of calls. People have a lot of things that are on their mind. They're troubling them. Barker, speaking of himself to answer his own question about fears, he says, I'm not a real worrier. I just am not. He says, I don't think I could be a real worrier after teaching this teaching for over 30 years. He says, after a while, you even begin to believe it, the teaching yourself. You gotta teach what you gotta learn. So you really do, you start to believe it. So all these affirmations repeated and taken into your heart and your mind, your consciousness, you begin to know, as Louise would say, all is well. You really do. And he says, I do believe it myself because I know it happens to be so. What can I do about anything that frightens me? And I don't mean frightening in the obvious way. I'm talking about what can I do about something that's deeply frightening? He said psychologists quite often say that we are frightened people, that underneath there's a lot of fear in most people. And he said there are these big basic fears, and then he spoke about a psychologist of the day who wrote a book on what he called basic emotions, which were tied into fears. He was thinking fear is the emotion. Fear is not of mind. It's not of intellect. Fear is emotion. He says that's why it's hard to really stop it. That's why you find it difficult to take your mind off of it. He said because it's emotion. And he said in that sense Freud was right when he said what you are is emotion, not your thoughts. And this is what the early teachers in our movement didn't really quite fully get. They were still talking about everything as thought. And it's not quite as simple as that. Your feelings may follow your thoughts, though. That's another thing to talk about. He says, now we see it quite differently. And why? Because the subconscious mind is the emotional mind. Deep within me, with everything I've learned since the time I was born, everything anybody has ever told me, it's there. And there's stuff it's emotional, and some of it's beneath the surface. We're not even conscious of it. The subconscious mind is what he called the emotional mind. And that's why it's the creative mind. That's why it does what it does, the way it does it. It's the creative mind, so you and I are basically emotion. That's why students and teachers of behavioral psychology say we haven't come very far from the animal kingdom. Because like the animals, we're pretty much governed by our emotions even now. We don't like to think about this, and he says, I don't really mention it very often because people don't want to hear it. Because most of us are proud of what we know and what we've learned and what we've accomplished in our lives with civilization and all the rest. And he says, we've come a long way. I certainly would never want to go back to earlier times, we've come a long way. We want to identify the negative emotions, though, and we want to deal with them. See, if you have something within you that's working against you, why would you not want to deal with it? If it's like beneath the surface, you just pretend it's not there. There was an author, Jacqueline Small, who used to say, I remember this line, all our battered places need to come to light. Because they're really still there. So we want to identify the negative emotions. We don't know where they came from always. Some of them we do know, and some of them have unknowingly come and brought to us by the society we live in, the family group we grew up in, or by the world in which we live. And others we personally have allowed to be in there because we've been in situations that we've allowed things to happen. But they stayed with us even after the situations are over. You can think of relationships and all kinds of things, the things you've told yourself. They've stayed with us because we didn't always realize that we could get rid of them. So he went on to say, why do the scriptures say, be not afraid? And he said, because it's holding out a challenge, it's holding out an ideal for us. Now someone's going to ask me, Dr. Barker, is it possible to be totally without fear? And he said, my answer would have to be no, it's not possible. But it's almost possible. And we need to move toward that goal always. You want to be minimizing the fears, minimizing the fears. You see, the great scriptures of the world have always been dealing with ideals. They've given us these great ideals, a vision of what could be. If only we change our view, behave ourselves individually and collectively, we'll get a glimpse of what life could be like. And he said, so these great minds, these great men and women, did give us and are giving us a broad vision of things to contemplate. And even though at the moment we don't fully embody them, he said, an example would be Christmas. He says, Christmas, you know what we sing about Christmas, you all know, right? Goodwill, peace, peace on earth and goodwill to people. We've been doing that for over 2,000 years. Peace on earth and goodwill for all people. Now, does that mean that we have it yet? Peace on earth? And you know of any place we have peace on earth yet, except possibly within ourselves? Is it a fact yet? No. He said, but it's an ideal. We've talked about the brotherhood of man. That's an ideal too. Or we've talked about the human family, loving our brother and sister as ourselves. Has that happened yet in the world? No, not really. What are they? They're great ideals. It's a vision. John Lennon, imagine, right? The world is being one. We've talked about the Spirit of God being active in the individual. That's what we talk about here all the time. That's an ideal, and it's a very good one, a very important one. It's there when you remember it. Louise would say, we remember and we what? We forget. When we're in connection, we remember. And when we remember we're one with the one, that's really a wonderful place to be. So, it's a great ideal, it's a very good one, it's an important one. And these things to which you and I are turning and trying to make practical in our individual experience. We're trying to say, all right, there may not be peace on earth yet, but how can I personally have peace? That's a better question. There may not be the brotherhood of man yet, but how can I like more people whom I don't like now? See, some of you want it all to change on the outside, but this is really the message is what can I do personally right now? How can I sit in less judgment personally? How can I gossip and complain less? Remember that wonderful statement, judge not that you be not judged. That same teacher said, I judge no one. He said because he was wise. He knew the futility of judgment because it only causes a reaction. So let's have less condemnation, less criticism. Does that mean you agree with whoever is opposing you or has a different idea? No, not at all. We realize that people are doing, as we always say, the best that they can with what they know. So we're not concerned with that. Barker digressed a bit in this next section, saying he wasn't very good at turning the other cheek. You've all heard turn the other cheek. He says, I'm not good at it. He said, but I believe in the soundness of it in principle. Then he got back to his own talk. He said, what can I do to minimize my fears? What can I do to face my fears? What can I do to expand my loving? These are good questions. And by that I mean, what can I do to expand my loving widely? What can I do to love more with wisdom? How can I love more with wisdom? How can I handle my present world right now with wisdom? My present life, not the world after I retire, not 2 years from now, but what can I do today to have an open heart, to be more loving, more forgiving? He says, I don't want to wait till I retire to do this. He says, if I don't handle what I'm doing right now with wisdom, he says, I won't be any smarter when I retire or next month or next year. What am I doing right now in handling my present world? He says, now on the surface, it looks pretty good. And your world on the surface might look pretty good too. But he says, we're not talking about the surface world where sometimes we wear a mask. See, some of you come in here, you get all dolled up, you look good and all that stuff. And some of you on the call, we know how to present ourselves in ways that are acceptable, right? But what are we doing beneath the surface? He called it in the world underneath, the world of emotion. He says, because that's where you're going to find consciousness. How are you handling that world? What is that like? The world of subjective belief and subjective motivation. How are you handling what's going on beneath the surface? He said, yes, on the outside, we can create this facade in most areas. I look good, sound good, right? He says it's necessary to do that to an extent. Nothing wrong with it, except that it gets a few cracks in it once in a while. And people do peek through and see aspects of us from time to time. And then he went on to talk about Barnum and Bailey. I'm sure you remember who Barnum was. Barnum is the circus. He said, Barnum says you can only fool some of the people some of the time. He says, I'm speaking of Mr. Barnum. He said, you can only fool the other person part of the time. So every once in a while, somebody's going to see through the chinks and see the holes. And they're going to see the great wall that we've built. He said, all of us wear masks. We want to be socially acceptable. We want to be liked. So all of us, we have a lot of things going on inside of us. Not the outer stuff, because again, we know how to present ourselves. But deep at the center of our being, we have this stuff, and we have God within, but we also have a lot of emotion and things that we maybe haven't yet dealt with completely. He said, this is where we use our mind. He said, that's why these great teachers with their statements have always said, fear not, be of good cheer. He said, these statements are fundamentally true. They're absolutely true, furthermore. But he said, they have to be built in. The idea of I'm whole and complete that we say so effortlessly here every week, you got to take those deep in. When Louise Hay so simply says all is well, you've got to take that in where you really inform yourself that all is well. It's more than just saying something that's a positive affirmation. They have to be built up within us through repetition, through conviction. Throughout this presentation, he's talking about through conviction. Through what we used to call faith. He says, I don't use that word faith as much anymore. He said, I used it for many, many years. He said, I like the word conviction better. Because here again, the word faith has been used so much in the religious field. I wonder if people really get it, that you need conviction. You need real conviction, strong conviction. If you really are working this teaching, you can heal your life. If you really are taking it into heart and mind and soul, you can heal your life. You can heal dis-ease. You can become prosperous as can be. Nothing is denied us. So what's the word he's talking about? Conviction, strong conviction. So people say, do you have faith in God? And he says, I say I am convinced there is a God. I'm convinced there is one eternal universal mind, and that it is in action in all life, and that it is in action in me. Of that I'm convinced. Because it's so easy to say, I have faith in God, or I have faith in the good, or I have faith in this, or I have faith in that. Yes, it is. He said, but is your faith a deep-seated emotional conviction? Again, I'll ask that question. Is your faith a deep-seated emotional conviction? Do you know that you have God within that's responding to you? Do you know that you have power within you that's unbelievable, that can do anything? Do you have that kind of emotional conviction? I talked about consciousness for years. He said, before I became really aware within myself about what it was. And that's true in my case too. I've heard the word consciousness for probably 30, 40 years. But I began to understand what it really means. From your consciousness, everything comes. And it's never about the other person. See, we have a tendency to talk about people, places, and things. But, if you're talking about what people are doing, places and things, you can. But, the thing that's most exciting to realize is I am creating this. It's not about them. It's never about them. It's never about the other person. So Barker was saying, I've talked about consciousness for years before I became really aware of what it is. I heard people talk about it too. I've been taught by my teachers. I've read the books myself. I know all about consciousness, but one day sitting still, I became aware of consciousness. And all of a sudden, I knew it. Now I knew of the power that I possessed. Now I'm glad the teachers taught me, and I read the books at the time. But I arrived at a total conviction that I am it. The whole bit. And that is all I really am. I am consciousness. And with it came a great sense of well-being. Because the whole world shouts at me, the outer world, that you're not this and you're not that. But you come to this teaching, you realize you're the whole thing. And you don't talk about the whole world anymore and what they're doing and what's wrong and what's missing, because you realize I'm cause to my own experience. Last Saturday, not yesterday, but the Saturday before, he said, I married a young couple in my office, very nice young couple. And he went on and on. I'll spare you all the anecdotal part. He said, of course, in the conversation, because I was filling out the marriage document, he said, I noticed they were 23 and 21 on the wedding certificate. And he says, I was delighted to be by the means by which the outer world could say they were one. So in the course of the conversation, he said, I don't know how it came up, but it came up. The groom said, well, you're pretty young to be a clergyman. And he said, oh, blessed art thou. He said, because most people who are 21 and 23 look at those of us over 50 as being like 108. And Barker at the time, I think, was in his mid-60s. He said, pretty soon they will be telling me, be sure to watch out when I cross the street to look both ways. He says, I know it's coming. And he said, that compliment from those young people perked me up for a day or so. Saying again, it helped me to reconvince myself that I'm consciousness and not body. That I am consciousness and not a calendar. I'm consciousness and I'm not a birth certificate. That I'm consciousness, and as consciousness I have total control of myself if I want to take it. It's entirely up to who. If you want it, if you want to live this no-limit life, if you want to, if you want to soar, if you want to hitch your wagon to the stars, you can have it. It's entirely up to you. But it requires a lot of conviction. And as my consciousness, and if my consciousness is such that I don't want to take control of myself, I can go along just as I've been going along, just like most of the world goes along. You can flow with the world, and it's very easy to do that. But if I want to be a unique person, if I want to have a better life, he says, I better pay attention to my worries, because those are the things that are going to be torpedoing your dreams. Because it's possible that the worries you have, everyone else has. And if so, then you're not terribly unique. You're just doing what everyone else is doing. And he asked the question, do you hear me? If you're on the same worrying role that everyone else is, he says, you're not becoming that unique person that you can be, that we think, people coming here want to be. You're one of the crowd. He said, it doesn't have to be that way. There's power for good in the universe, and you can use it. He says, at least if you're going to worry, he said, worry uniquely. And he laughed. He says, because it's way too easy to worry with the way the world is worrying. Just turn on the nightly news and just bring it all into your being, and you can worry together. he said, if you're tuning into any of our broadcasts, as many of you will be here in New York today and throughout the week, and you're starting to understand what we're talking about, you're beginning to realize that you are an individualization of spirit, unbound and totally free. You're beginning to realize that you are consciousness and not body. You don't remember if you don't remember another thing today, remember that idea for yourself. I am consciousness and not body. I am consciousness knowing. I'm consciousness feeling, sensing, and aware. And furthermore, I can discipline myself to use this consciousness. I can discipline it in such a way that I'm not so much afraid. He said, so for myself, I'm not anywhere near as much afraid as I was at any time earlier. Years ago, he was telling his story. He was friendly with Dr. Emmett Fox. When the atom bomb first arrived on the scene, a man rushed up to Emmett Fox, who was one of the leading teachers on New Thought. And this man rushed up to him and said, oh, Dr. Fox, what would happen if they dropped an atom bomb in New York City? And he looked at me, so he said, you'd never know it, so why get worried about it? But this man wanted to worry. He wanted to worry. So he said, so far it hasn't been dropped. Emmett Fox's casual answer was, you would never know it if it happened, so why worry? And of course, the man went back. He never came back to the church because he probably shook his head thinking, what's wrong with this minister? He couldn't understand why the minister isn't worried. Barker went on to joke a little bit about California and its San Andreas fault. And, you know, people will say, well, why aren't you worried about that? He says, these things don't bother me a bit. When I go out there, I'm not afraid. I don't expect the building to go down. I know whatever transportation I'm using, I don't worry about it. He says, I don't get afraid. And it's interesting, he said, what we can do with great fears and minimize them down to nothing. He says, because we can. Remember, he said, fear not, be not afraid. Or I'll change that a little bit, he said, in my language. Fear not, be less afraid. He said, that's a good place for many of us to start because seeing perfection does not come overnight for most of us. See, we talk about that in religious science all the time, seeing perfection, perfect place, perfect time, all the time. He said, but that doesn't come overnight for people just coming into the teaching. But if you keep looking at it, if you keep looking and seeing the good and the God like we talk about every week, you're going to start to get closer and closer. The kingdom of God is hand, everything is, God in my life and all that. That might take some time to understand. But perfection is something we move toward. It's something we earn. It's not bestowed upon us. Most people just don't get it immediately, though you could. The question he asked next of himself, is there a perfect person alive? He says, there probably is, there might be. He says, I wish I could see them walking around New York. He says, I wish I could see them walking down Fifth Avenue. I want to see a perfect person. He says, I haven't seen one yet. He said, I've seen some people who are physically pretty perfect, and I've seen other people with great minds who are intellectually pretty perfect. He said, I've seen all of these, but this idea of perfection has to be earned, and perhaps it's done by the erasure of our fears. The minimizing of fears is a move in that direction. I'm sure it is. Can I work toward a goal? You have to, otherwise there's no meaning in life. So he encouraged all of us to have our goals, to have our vision. Can I work towards the goal of less worry? And he said, yes, absolutely. And how do you do it? He said, you do it by having a program, an idea, a vision for some constructive good in your life. What are you going to replace fear with? He says, you replace your fear with faith, which I'm going to call conviction going forward. I mean, deep conviction in yourself and in life. All right, and he said, and then quickly, and then replace it with conviction. And then he said, can this be done quickly? And he says, no, it can't be. He says, no deep emotional change can be done quickly. But if you do it regularly and you practice it, you're going to be amazed before you're halfway through. He says, you notice why therapy seems to take a long time. He said, because individuals don't usually change quickly. I don't, you don't, whoever you are. He said, but I can change and so can you. You can heal your life. That was Louise. Hey, I can look back a year from today and you can be completely amazed because you'll have less fear and you'll have more conviction. I talk to people every week. I encourage people to come and tune in every Thursday, every Sunday. You won't get everything all at once. He says sometimes, you need to pick up a book. Sometimes you need to hear the lessons, once, twice, 3 times. But you'll get it. The more effort you put into it, the quicker you're going to see results. He said, I have less fear and more conviction, much less fear than I did a year ago. I feel happier. And that's what he said I hear from most people. So let's say one more thing. When you're afraid of something that you can do nothing about, he said that's the greatest waste of energy there is. So look at your fears and say, wait a minute. If it's one of those that you can do nothing about, you say, why am I fussing over this? I can't do anything about it other than tell myself that all is well. So why worry about that? He said, I have some friends who cannot understand why I'm not worried about the stock market, for example, because we own some stocks. He says, but there's nothing I can do about that. So he said, I don't like it when the economy is on the skids any more than anybody else. He says, but I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. And people say, well, what if it all goes broke? And he says, so what? It won't. But if it did, we'd find a way. The wise minds have said, be not afraid, because they knew that the fearful mind is a destructive mind, that a fearful mind, again, is destructive. And the mind with a conviction of goodness has a foundation. You see, that's there. That's what we talked about, the rock from which you build yourself. He said, if your house was founded on the rock, it will stand, if it's founded on conviction. If it's founded on sand, where will it go? Now, the house that's founded on rock is your consciousness. If you have a really strong consciousness, like you're the whole bit, nothing can touch you. Nothing can touch you, because you know who you are. You know what you are. So that's really about loving yourself and having that kind of faith. The house that's founded on that kind of rock, your consciousness, where you're absolutely more convinced of good than it is of anything else. He says, now sometimes I grit my teeth and I say, despite everything I hear or read or whatever, I'm still convinced that God is in business and the universe is good. I'm still convinced. He said, I talk to myself like that, and I tell myself I'm still convinced that God is in business and the universe is good. Now, everybody would like to deconvince me of this, and I can speak in my own life too. I've had students who tell me, Greg, get real. This is terrible, whatever it is. Awful people, awful circumstances. Everybody wants to convince us, and they want to get us to go to some version of ain't it awful. But most of us who are really deeply involved in this teaching, who have conviction, will go back to Barker's idea. I'm still convinced that God is in business and the universe is good. He said, I have to be. I'm certain that there's a goodness in life which the human mind cannot destroy. Now, it might be able to tamper with it a little bit. It might be able to manipulate it. It can turn it around, but it cannot destroy it. Because the fundamental nature of the universe is energy, and that energy cannot be destroyed. The fundamental essence of my being and yours is energy, love, and it can't be destroyed, even by you. Now, to come back, be not afraid. Be convinced of something good. Challenge yourself. Fear not, and minimize your fear. Go back to that thing. The universe is still in operation. It's still the operation of a magnificent mind, a magnificent goodness, a magnificent something, and I'm in it, and I'm of it. And it created me, and this whole thing is still wonderful. And those that have the eyes to see it, those of you who really practice the teaching, you're going to see it. And those of you who have the ears to hear it, will hear it. You'll be tuning out the other stuff. And those of you who didn't have spiritual perception, which is what he's talking about, they won't hear it and they won't see it. So if you're in a teaching like this where you know that the best kept secret in the world is God and you, and then you have the whole bit, you'll see it, you'll hear it. You and I can be aware that the infinite mind, spirit, life, love, wisdom is the very nature of ourselves. And as such, it's not afraid. And so it is for today. Thank you.